Hello, I'm Chuck Phillip, and welcome to another edition of Southern Home Talk. In order for this story to make any sense, I'm going to have to go over the early history of Highway 90. And it's also interesting to note that this was pretty much born right here in Mobile. In September of 1915, representatives from Mississippi, Louisiana, and Alabama met in Mobile and created the Alabama Gulf Coast Highway Association, seeking to spur the creation of a new highway along the Gulf Coast. The association sprung from the Good Roads movement, which beginning in the 1910s sought to create better transportation routes for the increasingly popular automobile. In the days before the 1926 creation of the U.S. federal highway system, such associations played an important role in road building. Supporters initially hoped for a road that would link Mobile to New Orleans via cities along the Mississippi Gulf Coast. Just 1 month later, however, the Alabama Gulf Coast Highway Association floated a more ambitious proposal, a highway from Miami, Florida, up the Florida Gulf Coast, through Mobile, and across coastal Mississippi to New Orleans. This future road was dubbed the Old Spanish Trail. Harrison County, Mississippi, began issuing bonds to construct a 25-mile beachfront road as a result of advocacy from the Alabama Gulf Coast Highway Association. But the effort soon lost momentum. Good roads advocates from Florida, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Arizona met again in Mobile, and this time they created the Old Spanish Trail Highway Association, which took as its mission the creation of a highway that would connect the east to the west. Any efforts previously initiated by towns along the proposed route would be incorporated into this new thoroughfare. The 419 delegates of the attendance in the meeting expanded their vision even further, planning a Southern National Highway from St. Augustine, Florida, to San Diego, California. Travelers crossing the country would experience the wonders of a nation and bring tourist dollars into the areas through which the route passed. In Mississippi, those areas would include the municipalities of Pascagoula, Goshen, Ocean Springs, Biloxi, Mississippi City, Gulfport, Long Beach, Pass Christian, and Bay St. Louis. Even though it would be identified as part of the Old Spanish Trail, this portion had no historical connection to the Spanish. It would be simply a coastal highway. Mississippi cities already had graded many miles of road on the beachfront, but with the coming of World War I, efforts halted. By 1919, the Old Spanish Trail Highway Association resumed work under the direction of Harold B. Ayers. The biggest challenge was the waterways. Efforts varied from city to city and county to county, with each one passing road bonds. Some areas still had dirt tracks, while others had improved bridges and roads. Mississippi's three coastal counties, Jackson, Harrison, and Hancock, moved forward with the construction. On November 17, 1925, the road known as the Old Spanish Trail became U.S. Highway 90, and by 1928, the last ferry on the highway route was replaced by the East Pascagoula Bridge in Jackson County. Over the next decades, projects such as the Biloxi Ocean Springs Bridge and the Bay St. Louis Bridge continued to improve the route from Mobile to New Orleans, and Highway 90 remained the main road for travelers. During the 1980s, the completion of Interstate 10, about 6 miles north, provided a second route across Mississippi coast, linking states to the east to those to the west. Doing the story on Old Highway 90 has actually brought back memories of this highway. I remember going over to Mississippi a few months after Hurricane Camille hit in 1969 and seeing these large ships washed up in people's yards. And I also remember being a conductor for CSX, and I drove trains back and forth to New Orleans, and a large portion of the main line also parallels Highway 90. And being raised in Spanish Fort, well, Spanish Fort got its name from the Spanish who built the fort here in the late 1700s. There was also a French family that was already here, and they gave them part of their land so they could build their fort on it. And they were a politically correct family as well, so they were friends with the Spanish and also the British, which in the end probably saved their life because they were eventually captured by the Indians and marched naked to the British outpost in Pensacola. And when they got there, the British ordered them released, saying, hey, these are our friends. But the point I'm trying to make here is more than likely there was probably a well-established trail between Spanish Fort and Pensacola, and more than likely that is Highway 90. They just simply paved over it. And it's kind of ironic too, because when you get out on the west part of the far extremes of the old Spanish Trail, well, it was some Spanish influences on the California side of this as well. Highway 90 was the lifeblood of many businesses across the nation, and our area was no different. I mean, when they completed the Causeway, is what I call it, from Spanish Fort to Mobile, back then it was called the Cochran Bridge. The whole span was, with the top of the hill being called Bridgehead. And George Fuller Jr. and Sr. fought that tooth and nail because they did not want Spanish Fort to be called Bridgehead. And ironically, it still appears as Bridgehead on some maps. And so, it also thrived business here in our community too, because had it not been for the Causeway being completed, that wouldn't have given birth to the golf course that George Fuller Sr. started in 1927. He came down from Chicago with some investors and built the golf course. And of course, in 1929, the Great Depression hit and that folded up. But in the 1930s, he started the tourist village here at the top of Spanish Fort Hill that got expanded out over time. Had cabins starting out at first, and then a hotel, a restaurant, and a 24-hour cafe and gas stations, and it just grew ever since. But Malbis also had pretty much the same amount of businesses that we did. And here's some postcards to look at. These are from the 40s and 50s. And this postcard here is the Malbis Hotel. And a friend of mine was a maintenance engineer there. And the hotel pool was shaped like the state of Alabama. And all this pretty much closed up around the early 90s. And that's where Lowe's sits today. And so apparently, me reading between the lines, I'm going to go ahead and put these letters up so you can read them. And you can pause the video too, because I'm going to try to keep this video short if you want to read those. But me reading between the lines on this, apparently Malbis submitted a proposal to put a turnout at the bottom of Spanish Fort Hill to redirect Highway 90 away from Spanish Fort. And the Fullers also submitted an alternative plan, and their plan is to have Highway 90 to continue up the hill and go up 31 a little ways and then cut back over and connect back to 90 that way. That way traffic can come by the businesses in Spanish Fort and still go on to Malbis as well. And so you can see this photograph, this Bass Pro Shop, I mean, that's where that road would have gone. It's pretty much right around in there somewhere. And you can see this plat map of their proposal. And so, anyway, apparently the Fuller's plan wasn't favored. I mean, I guess they did try to pull some strings with Congressman Boykin. You can see this is a photograph of George Fuller Jr. with Congressman Boykin in front of the old hotel. And here's another picture of Congressman Boykin at the dedication of Bonita Island. And you can see back behind him on that sign, says everything's made for love. That was his favorite saying. But anyway, getting back on point, apparently the Malbis plan won out, and that turnout went in down below the hill, and it's been that way ever since. And so the Fullers, they had signs. Before that was put in, they spared no expense as far as advertising Spanish Fort. In fact, Fuller had a massive neon sign put on top of this water tower, and that could be seen all the way across Mobile. And he did it on purpose because he was trying to get people to move from Mobile over here. And people over there said, well, why would you want to move way over there? Well, he would tell them it's not way over here. You can see the sign all the way across the bay. And you could, because I remember coming home at night from the shipyard, and you could see it really well. So he had to change his signs because of that turnout down there, and had to place them up on top of the hill. And you can see where he even put in bold letters in this one, I-10, to let people know they could still, access these roads if they was to come on up to the top of it. So I guess in the end, there hasn't been any road that's gone in that hadn't had some degree of controversy over it, including I-10. Bluff Base Road. I guess if I was in charge of issuing names to roadways, that's probably what I would have called this down here. But I kind of wonder if this road has contributed to the problems this Bluff has, or has had over the years. There's been some properties up on this bluff. There's houses up there. That was the first neighborhood built here. It's the old Spanish Fort Estates, with the first home, I believe, being built in 1947. Well, there were some people that's lost their entire backyards up there because of the bluff erosion. And I wonder if this road down here contributed to that. And so it's taken them a while to get that straightened out up there, which I hopefully that they have gotten it straightened out. But on another interesting footnote, I remember coming back from Mobile with my mother. Don't know why we were over there. And we were coming up the Spanish Fort Hill. And I remember seeing all these cars parked on the side of the road and people standing on the bridge edge looking down. And I guess my mother got curious too, so she stopped and we both got out. And we were looking down below and we could see all these emergency vehicles. And I remember clearly the ambulance there. Of course, being a kid, I was fascinated by emergency vehicles and the milkman uniforms that the ambulance personnel wore. And them loading up this guy on a stretcher and putting a sheet over his head and loading him in the back of the ambulance. And so when we got home that evening, over supper, we turned on the television, and on the local news, there the story was, what I just witnessed earlier. And I never will forget the name that they said on the news, Tremier. That's kind of an unusual name to me. But yeah, this was January the 23rd, 1967. Charles Stephen Tremier, who was the former mayor off and on of Mobile, that was who was killed in that wreck down below. His car hit the side of the bridge. Not sure the details of why that happened, but that was what the case was. He was killed in a wreck down there. And Tremier Park in Mobile is named after him. And I kind of wonder now, after seeing that the Scenic Overlook got named to the Larry D. Collier Scenic Overlook, that maybe this road down below should have been named the Tremier Turnpike.